Hello everyone! Today I have for you a step-by-step tutorial on how to recreate this big, bright sunflower. It's the perfect season for sunflower painting, and this is a great tutorial for beginners or any artist who needs some floral inspiration. So get your stuff and let's get started. I'm going to start by misting my paints with some water, and I am working today on a 10x7 100% cotton watercolor paper by the brand Baohong, I believe you say it. It's their Academy line. I'm just going to start by sketching where I want to put my sunflower. I don't want it perfectly forward facing. I'm going to have it almost tilted just slightly. So I want the center of my sunflower to be a little off to the side so that the stem has room on the page. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started sketching in that middle just so I have a point of reference of where to put my petals. I'm going to mix up some yellow colors. Today I'm using New Gamboge and Hansa Yellow Light. Any warm or cool yellows that you want, feel free to use. That's the thing I love about, painting in your own way is pick whatever colors you want. Obviously with a sunflower you want them to represent yellow, but there's so many hues within that color family that you can choose from, and I love mixing and putting a bunch of different ones for interest. So I'm going to start by, it's almost like a squiggle leaf shape. That's why these are pretty easy for beginners. You just take your paintbrush and you start at the tip, you push down and you squiggle out. I'm using a silver black velvet brush, which is not a snappy watercolor brush. It doesn't hold its shape very well, but I really love the look it gives to leaves. It almost gives them a frayed edged look. That is not what everyone goes for, but I really love it sometimes, especially with florals that I want to have a lot of movement in them. If you look at a sunflower, you'll see that there's layers of these types of petals. So I want some of them to fluff upward, almost like the wind is blowing some of them. So I am putting some small ones towards the center instead of just having them go all the way around the sunflower, almost like a clock, like hands on a clock. But it is really helpful for the rest of the flowers, or the petals, excuse me, to kind of space them out, like, the 12 and the 3 and the 6 and the 9 on a clock, because that way there's some good spacing. You don't need it to be perfect, obviously, but it is helpful. I clearly didn't do it perfectly spaced, but if you're new to painting sunflowers or flowers that are this shape, that can be really helpful. So I'm just going through and I'm taking some warm yellow on some petals and some cool yellow on other petals, and I'm even mixing them together, and I'm going back and forth, and I'm sometimes dropping in a little bit of pigment into these wet these wet petals to give them some color bleed. And so I'm just starting at the tip, squiggling out, and I'm making some of them pointed at the end and some of them more frayed. And now I'm going to start going in between those spaces where those petals were. Dropping in some color here and there so that you can see the variations between the petals, especially when you start to layer them on top of each other. I'm going to throw a few more in of those fluffed up petals as well. And you'll start to see that it's starting to come together. It's starting to look more and more like a sunflower with every petal that you add. And those petals towards the bottom of the sunflower, instead of having them layered on top of each other, you can tell that it looks like they were blown apart, and that's why those smaller ones towards the bottom of the stem, towards the bottom of the center, are fluffed up. I think I took some of my Aussie Green Gold, Aussie red gold and dropped it in to give it a darker burnt orange hue on some of those petals. You could also use something like burnt sienna or any orangey rusty color, or just orange if you want. I will leave a reference to the sunflower image I used. I found it on Unsplash, which is a copyright-free, royalty-free website. I'm not sure what it's called, but I made sure that it's free to use, so I will link that below. And I'm just adding a little bit more dimension, going back in. I'm letting some of them dry a little bit, and here I am putting a little bit of that Aussie red gold just at the very bottom of the petal, because it is darker there when I look at my reference image. One of the great things about using 100% watercolor paper versus like cellulose paper and things like that is that you can work with the colors. You can blend them in without there being harsh lines. You have more working time in general because the water doesn't absorb as quickly. I use cellulose paper like Canson Watercolor XL watercolor paper all the time for practice, and I highly recommend it for practice, but I find when I'm painting with watercolors that 100% cotton paper is just the way to go. It gives me the vibrancy I want, it gives me the working time, and it's just way less stressful, honestly. It is more expensive, but it is well worth it as far as art supplies, in my opinion. Taking some of that, I think it was transparent orange from Winsor & Newton, mixing it with the Aussie red gold to give further dimension. Just looking around for any gaps that I need to fill. I do want to make sure that I leave some negative space at the base of the petals, where the tip of the petal meets the center of the flower. That way there is some of the paper showing through and it's not just a blob of yellow right up against all brown. You do want some of that negative space to shine through. Just adding a little more color, doing a little bit of blending, adding some of that darker orange to the base of the petals for dimension, and we are almost done with the petals. Now I'm going to go in with just some plain water and start to fill in where the center of the sunflower goes, trying to be careful not to touch the yellow petals. I'm okay with a little bit of bleeding though, to be honest. And then I'm taking a little bit of my Winsor & Newton sepia color, and I believe a little bit of raw umber, and I'm just slowly going around. I'm not precious about this. It's okay if these touch. In fact, I really love bleeding, but in this moment I'm trying to be a little bit careful. One of the great things about this silver black velvet round brush, I forgot to mention it was a round brush earlier, is that the tip tapers so great that you can really get in tiny spaces with it, and it won't make a mess. I'm just going in, I believe, with what color? What color am I using? I think it is a little bit of my Pematite Genuine, which is a Daniel Smith color. I did a video on my favorite Daniel Smith colors, and this was one of them. It is like a brownish red granulating color that is gorgeous. I did notice there was some red tones and even a little bit of green slightly in the middle of this stem, of this the center of the flower. But right now I'm going in with a little bit more sepia around the edges, just letting that bleed out, giving it more definition, going in between those little petals. See how that tip is so fine, it can get right in there. I love these brushes. I'm going to go in with a little bit of my, I think it's Azo Nickel Yellow and some of my Winsor Newton Green Gold. They're very similar colors. And just tapping a little bit of that into the center. I don't want the center to look visibly green, but I want to give it a little bit of that tint. So much of what you see when you're painting is not actually everything that you paint is never one solid color. It's always a variation of colors. And so to get that artist eye and really like hone in on what you're seeing, and realizing, oh, the center of the sunflower is not just one shade of brown. It is multiple shades of brown, a little bit of warm green, a little bit of like, you know, even blues sometimes and things like that. And just kind of taking your own interpretation of that and going in can make such a difference with your paintings. I'm taking a little bit more of that sepia color and I'm starting to dot the sunflower seeds that you would see around while the paint is still wet. So it disperses a little bit. It's not soaking wet, so it's not just gonna spill out everywhere, but the paper is damp enough that those little dots will just spread out ever so much. And then when it completely dries, I'll go back in with a thicker consistency of the paint and really make them even bolder. But I like layering in this way. I really love working wet on wet and then going back and doing wet on dry for like more bold details. I'm now going in with, I think this is yellow ochre, and just adding some of that earthy yellow color in there. Once again, using 100% cotton paper, I just have so much more working time. I can go in and play around without stressing too much that it's already dry, and as someone who loves to do wet on wet, that's a big deal to me. A little bit more of that sepia and just little by little adding dimension. Okay, now we are going in with the stem and the leaves of a sunflower. If you look at a sunflower stem, it's more like a stalk. It's thicker, and you know how high up they can rise. And I am making sure not to put that stem directly in the middle of the sunflower, because as you see by the angle of the flowers and the center of it, that it's not straight on. It's tilted slightly, so I want the stem to also kind of curve and be tilted. And I am drawing lines on the stem so I have negative space in between. And now with the leaves, I am just starting with the tip, pushing down and bringing that brush right back up to create that taper. It's not too dissimilar to how we made the petals, just it's in a more swooping fashion, because if you look at a reference image of sunflower leaves, they don't stick straight out. They almost start to grow upward and then they swoop down a little bit like a wave. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm never trying to perfectly recreate what I'm seeing. I'm just taking the impression and the movement of it and putting my own spin on it. I'm going in with some, I believe it's Hooker's green, some sap green, and I like to go in with like a light wash of color and then drop in darker colors. I love my greens, so I use a huge variation of them. I use some undersea green, some green apatite genuine. You absolutely do not need to use all these colors. And you can even mix your own greens very easily. You can add some blues to make them cooler and deeper and things like that. But I love playing with all my greens. They're so fun. And I'm doing one more petal Just kind of swooping that one again, starting off with a little bit of sap green, and then I will go in and add drops of dark into it while it's still wet, and it just disperses out so beautifully. I'm taking some of that green gold, add a little bit of variation in the hues of the greens that I'm using. I like bringing some of that earthy green color into my florals. Throwing a little bit into the stem. And now I'm going to start adding, I don't know what they're called, but the back of a sunflower, you see those green, tiny, they're not leaves, but they're what the flower sprouts out of. I should probably look up the actual name of them. But they're kind of like little baby leaves that crop out. And I'm just throwing a few towards the top of the stem here. They don't need to be perfect. They just need to give you an idea of what they are. And I'll just keep adding a little bit here and there. Taking some of that nickel yellow and green gold. And just adding it to that, to those little baby, like, hairs. Now that those petals are completely dry, I'm going to go in with some of my new gamboge and create the lines you see on a sunflower petal. I'm just very loosely putting a few in here and there. I'm not by any means doing hyperrealism, but once again, it's about the impression. You see these squiggle lines, you know what it's referring to on the sunflower petal. I want to make sure that there's not too much water on my brush. I want it to be pretty dry, and I want the watercolor paint to be pretty thick, like a cream consistency or a butter consistency, I sometimes hear it called, so that it's very opaque. And if you have too much water on your brush, it can make it look a lot more transparent, and I can also struggle to make the lines like as teeny tiny as I really want, because the water swells the bristles. So I'm going to speed this part up a little bit because it is a lot of just going in and adding some lines and blending out and fine-tuning my details. And now that that center is completely dry, I'm going to go in with another layer of sepia. Once again, more of that butter consistency with a drier brush. And I'm going to start dotting in more seeds. I'm now going in with some of that burnt sienna to give it more of a warmer brown variation in the middle. Please excuse if you can hear my children playing Mario Kart. Doing voiceovers is my only option at this point. Okay, now I'm doing the same thing with the leaves. I'm going to do a little bit of veining. Nothing crazy. I'm not really following too closely the sunflower reference, but I do, again, want an impression of detail and veining on my leaves. So I believe I went in with Hooker's Green, and I'm just carefully dragging. I like to lift my brush a lot when I'm doing line work, like not just drag and do one whole line. I like to kind of make it skip, and then if I feel like it needs to be filled in, I can go back and add it in. I don't know, it's just one of those things as an artist that I've always kind of done, and the brush was a little too dry, so I had to dab in a little bit of water, but that made it too wet. And water control is such a important principle of watercolor painting, and it's taken me years and years to try to perfect, and I'm still not there, but yeah, it's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing learning process. I don't want to overdo the veining. Sometimes it can overwhelm, especially when I've already dropped in so many other colors when I was doing wet on wet. I would love to do, tutorials without doing a voiceover, but now that it's summer, right now it's summer, and it's just not an option because it's too loud with my kids home for the summer. So once they go back to school, I can't wait to do more live tutorials, basically. Just doing a little bit of blending here and there. I find at the end of a painting, there's a lot of going back and forth and trying to smooth things over and add a little bit here and add a little bit there, so it gets a little tedious to watch. But I also wanted to mention, I get asked on Instagram sometimes about my watercolor palette that I'm using. It's actually a custom palette. My husband made it for me so sweetly for my birthday last year. I adore this palette. It's like my nature palette. It's from years of collecting different paints. A lot of them are Daniel Smith and Winsor & Newton. There's some Sennelier in there and Holbein, and I would love to share everything that's in it one day for a video if you're interested. But yeah, this wooden palette he made custom, and he added an acrylic piece into the top, so I had a palette to mix colors on, and it's my prized possession for sure. I'll have it for years to come. But I have seen other ones on Etsy if you are interested in that style of a watercolor palette. Just thought I'd throw that in there in case anyone was wondering. And now for this final detail, I'm just putting on those teeny tiny little hairs you see on the stalk of a sunflower, just for a little flair. It's not necessary, but I like it. I like the fuzzy look that it gives. And that is it. We are done with our big sunflower. I hope you had fun recreating this piece with me. Please tag me on Instagram so I can see your creations. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I will see you guys later. Bye!